morning and welcome everybody to the Institutionalizing Conflict-Sensitive Education webcast, Resources and Challenges. My name is Nina Weisenhorn and I'm a Senior Advisor at USAID focusing on education in crisis and conflict. Today we'll be going through a recent product from the partnership that the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network developed in partnership with Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, INEE. Through the Education and Policy Working Group and the Conflict Sensitive Education Sub-Working Group, ECCN partnered with INEE to study the second phase rollout of the Conflict Sensitive Education PAC. Through this partnership, ECCN supported INEE to study and conduct research about how institutionalization of conflict-sensitive education happened across a variety of organizations. If you're not familiar with the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, it's a forum for collaboration, networking, information, and knowledge sharing that USAID and its implementing partners use to increase access to education in crisis and conflict networks. This partnership was one of the partner initiatives that was developed jointly with INEE and the partners on today's webcast. We're pleased to have them with us. Building off this partnership from 2015 to 2018, USAID released its latest USAID education policy, which further strengthened our commitment to conflict-sensitive education. The USAID education policy defines clearly a key principle of promoting equity and inclusion, and specifically defines key actions and how to do this by designing education programs that are accessible, inclusive, culturally, and conflict sensitive. In addition, in USAID's education policy, we also define conflict-sensitive education, which is directly aligned to INEE's definitions of education, conflict-sensitive education. And so today, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Emmeline Marchot, who is a French language community facilitator and has been instrumental in helping support INEE's conflict-sensitive education PAC, and will walk us through key concepts of what conflict-sensitive education is. Following Emmeline's presentation, we'll hear directly from Senior Lecturer Dr. Kelsey Shanks, who led the institutionalization research that was supported by ECCN and INEE. Finally, we'll hear from Noemi Gerber, who is an education specialist at War Child Holland, about their experience institutionalizing conflict-sensitive education processes across their organization and how they became a stronger learning organization. Finally, we'll close with Daniel Levan, who is the who is the protocol and metrics specialist on ECCN support team and has been leading an effort to develop with our community key indicators for measuring conflict-sensitive education in our programs. So with that, I'll waste no further time and get over straight to Emmeline, who will share more about INEE's conflict-sensitive education PAC. Over to you, Emmeline.
Thank you very much, Nina. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you who joined us this morning. So I wanted to start this short presentation on the purpose, process, and implementation of the CSE PAC with this slide, on education. Education can contribute to peace building and social transformation, and education can reinforce the causes of conflict. Why am I starting with this to talk about the purpose of the PAC? During training, I worked with very experienced and skilled education and emergency professionals. Some of them had worked in education and emergencies for over 20 years, but had never considered that education could play a negative impact on their learners. And this is what conflict conflict-sensitive education is about. This is what it means. It's bearing in mind that education can contribute to something positive, but can also be something negative. So it's taking actions to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts of education on conflicts. It is there to help practitioners and policymakers to ensure that what they develop or what they're working on is conflict sensitive. Conflict sensitive education, although the title might seem complicated, is very simple. It's a process, it's an approach. It's based on the do no harms principle, and it's basically a set of recurring questions and a way of thinking when you work on education in emergencies. So I will now show you what the 3 steps of conflict-sensitive education are. So number 1, it's crucial to understand the context. By the context, we mean the conflict, we mean the background of the region where you're implementing your program in, for example. Number 2, it's to analyze the two-way interactions between the context and education. Again, the positive or the negative impacts of education. Number 3, it's to act to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts of education. You can learn more about this by following an online training, which is on the INEE website. You can reach out to me and I will be able to send you resources and dates of next trainings on CSE. But before that, I will show you what the pack looks like. So you have a picture of it, and I never go without it. The pack, here it is, has 3 components. It has the guidance note, which is the booklet, which offers strategies for developing and implementing conflict-sensitive education programs and policies. The second tool is the guiding principles that can be adopted by organizations and used to raise awareness and institutionalize the foundational principles that promote conflict-sensitive education. And finally, the reflection tool, which is pretty much like a checklist of the questions that one should ask to ensure that conflict sensitivity is integrated in education at all stages of the program. So whether it's assessment, design, implementation, management, monitoring, or evaluation. All those tools can also be used for advocacy. So drafting messages, the guiding principles will guide you. The pack in itself is to ensure that conflict sensitivity is integrated in education. So that's the key message that I want you to take away. Over the last 2 years, even less, I've facilitated 4 trainings. So one in Juba in South Sudan, organized by Oxfam, IBIS, and NRC. And 2 in Goma, DRC, one in October 2018 and another one in June 2019, as part of a consortium with DEFCO, NRC, and INEE. I'm also going to facilitate another training next Monday in Tanzania, in Kibondo. What I wanted to mention about the trainings, so we introduced the pack, the 3 tools during the trainings, and we use 8 different modules that are available online on the websites. Why has the CSE pack been such a success? It's because it's very relevant to the users and to the practitioners. The content is excellent. It was designed to really answer the questions that the practitioners needed to answer. What is also a strength is that we have a lot of partners engaged to work on CSE, and in all locations where I've been, there's a strong willpower to move things forward and integrate CSE within the programs and the policies. I noticed also that there was active participation of of the training participants. Sorry, and well, for the trainings that have taken place, there was funding. So that's one thing that we must have before we move forward. The weaknesses is that the target group is not directed at teachers, and it could be an idea, to target teachers as well. Another weakness is that there are very few facilitators in conflict-sensitive education, and that can be limiting. And also dissemination, again, because of lack of human resources and lack of funding, we cannot move forward, we cannot do the follow-up, we cannot do the monitoring. The challenges observed are mainly on security. When we took the conflict-sensitive pack to South Sudan, we were asked to delete the word conflict in all of the materials. We had to use context-sensitive education because, for security reasons. The lack of political will and political support to institutionalize or integrate CSE principles in the curriculum, in the policies, leads to abandonment and delays. Sometimes we have partners that want to move on, that want to offer training, but then there's issues with politics and we cannot move forward. The good news is that we have, sorry, it was the one before, we have increasing demand, and a lot of donors are getting interested, and some of them have even requested to attend training so that they are more aware of what it entails. The lessons learned overall is a strong need for engagement. Although we have engagement from the participants and from the partners that are already on board, we need more than that. Without that engagement, we will not succeed with institutionalization of CSE. So there is need for funding, for monitoring and evaluation. Also, the need for a pool of trainers or to have more facilitators in CSE. The need for an adaptation for teachers of some of the modules, probably not the 8 modules, but some of them, and need for institutionalization, which is what we're talking about today. And this is what our colleague, Dr. Kelsey Shank, will talk about. Kelsey is the research consultant on CSE, and she's going to talk to you about the challenges of institutionalizing CSE in EIE. If you have any questions, please write your questions or reach out to me and my INEE address, which will be shared with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmeline. So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the practical application of CSE and how organisations can go about turning their understanding of conflict sensitivity into CSE programming and practice. The findings I'm going to present are taken from an 18-month research project that looked into the application of the INEE CSE Training of Trainers program, and drawing on background review of mainstreaming and organisational change literature, as well as the practical experiences of 3 organisations who took part in the training. So yes, I'm not going to spend much time highlighting or unpacking what mainstreaming or institutionalization mean in this context. I don't think we have time, but I do think it's interesting to note from the start that efforts to mainstream conflict sensitivity across all sectors, not specific to education, have actually outpaced traditional cross-cutting themes such as gender and monitoring and evaluation in terms of both budget and also staffing capacity. Awareness raising, capacity development, and sector-specific tools have all been widely developed, and nearly all the leading development and humanitarian agencies have in some way engaged with the process of conflict-sensitive mainstreaming for the last 20 years. And this engagement has been demonstrated by a number of practical activities that fall under 3 main headings, which are building a community of specialists, tool development and training, and advocacy. Okay, bear with me. So in terms of the community of specialists, by this we mean the establishment of conflict units or conflict advisors within donor or aid agencies, the creation of conflict sensitivity champions who are given the mandate to try to mainstream the concepts throughout their entire organisation across sectors. In terms of investments in tools and guidance and capacity development, there are now various guides and checklists that have been published on how to tackle conflict sensitivity, and there are numerous approaches that organisations can turn to for guidance. And this has resulted in a wider shift in recent years towards the more sectorially defined conflict sensitivity thematic tools that we see in education. And lastly, there's been a large push for advocacy. A considerable amount of awareness has been generated regarding the need for conflict sensitivity. Having politically savvy individuals who can provide expertise and consistently advocate for CS has been noted as a really important strategy. Yet, despite these efforts, it's been highlighted by many commentators and by the research that we conducted that despite these interventions, they haven't really resulted in widespread changes at a practice level, on a country level in practice. And this deficit can be explained if we look at it through the lens of organisational change. From this perspective, you can see that the current guidance on providing mainstreaming tends to be quite random. It lacks clarity on what actually needs to be done. And it also fails to acknowledge that organisational environments are often fundamentally reluctant to change. And when I'm talking about these initiatives, I'm talking across sectorial, not just within education, but they apply to both. And this has kind of resulted in a failure to integrate CSE tools and methodologies across inter-programme cycles and actually on-ground activities. And that's really what this research has been very particularly interested in, is how do we as education actors move beyond the tools and advocacy to actually integrating CSE into daily practices. So if we examine what needs to be addressed from this organisational change, become very important. Both developing internal systems of review and external systems. And finally, an enabling environment to facilitate the uptake of new processes. So I'm just going to talk through each one in turn, and I hope you can hear me. I believe there's some problem with the actual audio, so hopefully that's going to correct itself. So firstly, commitment. And again, I think, yeah, commitment. Okay. Buy-in from top-down management is obviously important, but CSE also requires commitment and motivation across an organisation. However, there are a number of obstacles to achieving commitment and motivation that affect all levels of actors in an organisation. And I just want to highlight two that are quite important. Firstly, there's the issue of timing. The time pressures faced by implementing organisations to spend large amounts of donor money very quickly can result in a failure to adopt the time-consuming conflict sensitivity practices that are needed, such as conflict analysis and ongoing updating of the information gathering. The humanitarian system is obviously driven by urgency, and the time pressure to hit spending and results targets often limit the work that we can do within CSE in a practical level. For donors in particular, spending to target is often a very key criteria for staff promotion. So we have this very powerful incentive system that runs counter to what we want to achieve. Another obstacle that we don't necessarily think of immediately is the fact that we need to measure impact. So no donor or implementing agency has successfully and systematically documented the benefits of conflict sensitivity by drawing on field-based evidence or lessons learned and impacts. And that's partly because conflict sensitivity, like education, the impacts are only generated over long-term timescales and often beyond the lifespan of the programme. And they're also very qualitative. And this means it's particularly hard to measure. And in this sense, the old adage of what gets measured gets done works to the detriment of what we're trying to achieve. So if we move on, we have organisational culture. By this, we mean how things are done within an organisation, very simply. Organisational cultural norms influence an agency's tendencies and strategic choices. They impact how an organisation responds to things we're trying to change and our operating environments. And therefore, the culture of an organisation will impact how it deals with key CSE issues like knowledge management and learning. Knowledge and information are central to conflict-sensitive principles. We need to understand our context, understand the changes in that context, and how they impact our operating environment. And this needs to be an ongoing process of learning and information gathering, not a one-off activity. So how organizations relate to those changes is really important, and how their culture actually becomes one of learning. It has been noted a lot in the academic literature and through experience that often development and humanitarian organizations are driven by a culture that values doing over understanding, because they're often in life or death situations. It's very understandable. But taking that time for the learning processes and then creating a culture around that is really important. The next factor is capacity building. The principal tool for building staff capacities so far for CSE has been through training. Not particularly with the INEE program, but with others that we've looked at. There tends to be a focus very much on theory rather than practice. And more often than not, conflict sensitivity trainings across sectors are usually single workshops with no follow-up or monitoring that they have in common. Training often focuses on these conceptual understandings rather than practice. And in this sense, there's a lack of focus on how to develop the mechanisms and procedures we need to work in this way. We just understand that we need to. And then we have accountability. So internal accountability is pretty obvious. We need to provide systems that provide appropriate rewards and disincentives that inspire staff within organisations. But externally as well is really important. We should ensure that organisations are held accountable for the negative consequences of their programming if they're not conflict sensitive. Yeah, unfortunately, donors seldom monitor the use of conflict sensitivity by implementing agencies, and thus have little knowledge of whether it's adopted beyond the funding phase. Conflict sensitivity assessments usually centre on process and not outcomes, so it's generally easier to ask people, will they undertake a specific task, rather than actually evaluating it in hindsight to see if it worked. Consequently, donor policies rarely apply any consequences for a failure to adopt conflict sensitivity, and this works as a massive disincentive on the ground with high pressure environments. And lastly, the enabling the external environment. This is pretty common sense. I think most people are doing this already. It's talking to your local partners, it's talking to donors, it's ensuring that everybody's on the same page with what needs to be done. So in addition to these organisational change framings that we've just gone through, there are also some very specific education-focused observations that need to be explored a little bit more. And the first is the blood objectives that was mentioned a little bit before when you talked about training of teachers. And by this, I mean that it must be acknowledged that the pursuit of conflict-sensitive education in fragile environments is actually a dual endeavour. It's not one pursuit. Firstly, agencies must strive to ensure that their own interventions are in themselves conflict sensitive. And then secondly, ministries of education and government actors should be supported to ensure that they can make the wider education system conflict sensitive in itself. Currently, training guidelines for CSE do not clearly distinguish between these two objectives. And this has served to kind of hamper the setting of really clear and realistic CSE targets for different actors that undertake training. The in education intervention, we must acknowledge the political nature of education. I'm not sure if you can still hear me, unfortunately. We must acknowledge the political nature of education. Education interventions generally positioned within the confines of state systems, and yet conflict-sensitive education resources often fail to acknowledge that politics and power can be at the very root of many of the conflict-sensitive practices. And in this respect, they fail to address the broader incentives and disincentives that may impede conflict sensitivity. We must consider organisational mandates and power dynamics. Who are best placed to address possible structural inequalities in a system if we're looking at the state system? And this goes back to the first point. We need a clear idea of objectives and targets rather than targeting all education professionals with the same CSE objective. And in this sense, some strategic alliances can be formed in terms of working with partners in the governance sector or organisations with human rights mandates that actually have the mandate to approach the government on these issues where educationalists sometimes don't. And then there's lastly conflict-sensitive education staff buy-in, and this kind of combines the previous two. There still needs to be a significant shift in educational mindsets in terms of the damage that education can do in a conflict environment and vice versa. There's still very much a neutrality to interventions that needs to be overcome. We often talk in our own circles about the need for conflict sensitivity, but I think that needs to be broadened out so that we're not talking in our own silos. So unfortunately, the research has revealed that attempts to mainstream conflict sensitivity have been particularly particularly ineffective across all sectors, not just education. And while actors had accepted policies that protect the principle and have provided tools and analysis and understanding, they failed to provide practical guidelines on what this actually means in practice for someone working in this environment. And in addition, education actors do face disciplinary specific challenges due to the state-driven nature of their operating environment that can't be ignored and need to have more attention. Achieving conflict-sensitive education is not really a technical endeavour that it's presented to us as. It's deeply rooted in power relations and politics if we're talking outside of our own interventions and we're talking about the state system. And again, there's this need to divide and create guidelines for each separately rather than try to put them together. I know there's been lots of problems, unfortunately, with my audio, so I apologise. And I will hand over now to Naomi from War Child Holland, who's going to demonstrate how they have tried to tackle some of these key issues within their own CSE mainstreaming efforts.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. Hello, everyone. As Kelsey mentioned, I'm going to talk about, try to give you a very practical insight into how we at War Child Holland have been trying to institutionalize conflict-sensitive education and some of the challenges and opportunities we've encountered. And if you think back to the 5 elements of organizational change that Kelsey was just talking about, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the organizational culture and the capacity building, so 2 of those 5 elements. So just to give you a bit of context, War Child Holland is a non-governmental organization that's working with conflict-affected children in conflict-affected contexts in about 15 countries, providing them with education, child protection, and psychosocial support programming in order to contribute to their improved well-being and opportunities for growth and development. Because we're working in conflict-affected contexts, we recognize the importance of taking a conflict-sensitive approach. And given the big push around conflict-sensitive education in the education and emergency sector in the last few years, the institutionalization of conflict-sensitive education was incorporated into our global education strategy a few years ago as one of our key priorities. This was also around the time that INEE and partners were rolling out the regional trainings on conflict-sensitive education that some of you may have attended even. And I believe this is also when Kelsey started or was doing her research on CSE. So at the time, War Child's internal education community of practice started looking into how to go about this. It's great to have an aim, but how do you actually get it done, especially something as big as institutionalization? So to get inspiration, we tried to look into experiences of others in the education and emergency sector. And we also looked at experiences mainstreaming or institutionalizing the minimum standards, since the INEE minimum standards have existed much longer than the INEE CSE Pact. And as we felt that embedding the minimum standards in an organization would be a similar process in terms of organizational change needed as embedding conflict-sensitive education. So what did we find? Well, actually, we didn't find very much, but I must admit we didn't do the in-depth research and literature review that Kelsey did. And the little information that we did find when we looked around and asked around was not in-depth enough for our purpose. We were really looking to plan practically on how to go about this big process, and we didn't find much. What we did gather, though, was a need to focus on 2 things in particular. There we go. To focus on people on one hand and on the institutional level on the other hand. So in terms of people, looking at human capacity, people's awareness of conflict-sensitive education and their ability to apply it in practice. And on the institutional side, looking at commitment, systems, policies, and processes needed to make sure that conflict-sensitive education can be embedded within the whole organization. So based on this, our rationale was that if we would start building a community of specialists, as Kelsey mentioned, internally, we could make sure that conflict-sensitive education can start being applied in country offices, and eventually we can tackle the larger institutional level together with a group of champions that can help us work on that institutional level. At the same time, shifting over to give you another bit of context that's really important. Since 2016, War Child Holland has also been prioritizing the institutionalization of learning within the organization. So we're trying to become a learning organization that has a really robust learning culture and has a supportive learning environment for staff and partners. And the ambition is to become a learning hub that can benefit others externally as well. So the key to this are making sure that we are continuously learning from each other, from our programs, and from others externally, and that we're continuously transforming based on that learning. So making sure that we are transforming ourselves, the way we work, and the programs for greater impact in our work. So actually this other context in terms of trying to institutionalize learning in the organization was a really great thing for our endeavors to institutionalize conflict-sensitive education. Because if you think about it, conflict-sensitive education is all about a cycle of analysis, reflection, and action. And that was actually what was being pushed at the same time in the organization through the learning organization too. So a lot of change in the last few years and a lot of ambitions to go somewhere. But where did we go from here? Well, like I said, we decided to start by focusing on people and by focusing on the capacity building around conflict-sensitive education. But we also decided that we needed to move beyond trainings, which is very much in line with what Kelsey mentioned earlier. But why? If you look at the 70-20-10 model of learning by McCall, Lombardo, and Eichinger, then you'll understand that actually 70% of our learning happens on the job, 20% of our learning happens through others or from others, and only 10% of learning actually takes place through formal learning opportunities such as trainings. So if we want to have more solutions with more sustainable learning impact, we need to start looking beyond trainings. At the same time, I'm sure many of you have challenges of bringing everyone together at the same time and in the same place for a training. So we were really looking at self-paced and self-directed solutions to learning, where the learner is in control of their own learning. So bringing this all together, the learning organization and the ambition to institutionalize conflict-sensitive education, we decided that our first step in terms of institutionalization should be to focus on developing a learning path around conflict-sensitive education. Now, a learning path is something very new in War Child. It's basically what we call trajectories of learning activities with very clear learning objectives. So if education advisors are able to build their capabilities through such a learning path, then eventually they could become champions in their countries and help us with the rollout. You might think, well, this sounds very abstract. What is a learning path? So let me quickly introduce the learning path on conflict-sensitive education that we've been developing. So this learning path is made up of 3 units that are fostering progressive buildup of competencies. The first unit focuses on the learner being able to promote conflict-sensitive education. So that requires understanding and being able to explain conflict-sensitive education to others. So it's quite basic. The second unit looks at making sure that the learner is able to actually apply conflict-sensitive education in practice, which is really important, of course. And the last unit looks at equipping the learner to build other people's capacities in conflict-sensitive education. So ideally, a learner who will go through this learning path will be able to do all those things by the end of it. Each unit is made up of a series of activities, and each activity has a specific learning objective. Most activities are self-paced, so the learner can do them at any time. The instructions are all hosted online, but if someone has poor internet access, it's very easy to give offline instructions as well. Especially because a lot of the activities are actually very practical and don't require you sitting behind a computer necessarily. So to give you some examples of what the Unit 1 would cover, that involves the learner developing a visualization on conflict-sensitive education, or having a debate with someone on conflict-sensitive education. interviewing someone perhaps, or taking a tool and using it. These are the kinds of really practical activities that we've incorporated into this learning path. Now you might think, how is this different from a training and what is the benefit? Well, as Kelsey mentioned earlier, trainings often focus on the conceptual level. So what we're trying to do in this learning path is to focus much more on the practice, to give the learner that opportunity to practice the skills and make sure that new knowledge is applied and new skills are fully developed. So hopefully by the end of this, our education advisors will be much more confident than after a training to really apply and use conflict-sensitive education. So to quickly conclude, this is a really new approach for us at War Child. We're still learning. We're just about to pilot this learning path with our education advisors. And we look forward to what that has in store for us in terms of learning. And we also have a strong belief in sharing our resources with others, such as this learning path. So in future, our desire is to make this available for others in the sector who are interested. We're also always open to external testers. So if you're interested in having a look and giving us feedback, please contact me via my contact details. And yeah, just to conclude, our process of institutionalizing conflict-sensitive education is far from over. And as we heard from Kelsey, there are a lot of challenges to it, but we do believe it's a really important thing. We've made some interesting progress, and we look forward to what's in store next and learning from others as well. And now I'm going to hand over to Daniel, who is going to introduce us to new indicators on conflict-sensitive education.
Thank you very much, Noemi, and hello, everybody. As Nina mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to be talking about an initiative that's specific to the USAID Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, but I think it'll become clear that it's very relevant to all of the issues that have been raised by the first three speakers. Indeed, at the beginning of the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network project back in 2015, 2016, there was a lot of stock taking done of the then USAID mission and implementing partner practices for USAID projects in crisis and conflict or in post-conflict context that were focusing on increasing equitable access to education, to quality basic education in these kinds of contexts. And as part of this stock taking, support team members conducted an analysis of the performance indicators that were used on this category of projects. And for this, they were able to access 25 monitoring and evaluation plans from USAID projects that were ongoing or had recently concluded at that time. And along the lines of issues that Kelsey highlighted in her presentation, indeed it was found that out of these 25 projects, only 3 of the projects actually had codified CSE into an indicator, an actual performance indicator on the project to track aspects related to conflict sensitivity. And there were only a total of 4 conflict sensitivity related indicators out of 370 total indicators across the projects that were reviewed. And furthermore, there was very little within the M&E plans as a whole that was explicit or formalized commitment to conflict sensitivity documented within these plans. So a consensus formed within USAID ECCN that it could definitely provide a useful service to missions and implementing partners and help to scaffold their capacity and their focus on conflict sensitivity to develop a set of recommended but custom and customizable indicators for conflict sensitive education. As Kelsey also highlighted, like you really do what you are measuring to do. And I think a lot of people who work on projects know that there's nothing like having an actual performance indicator to create a formal mechanism for accountability around what it is that indicator is measuring, as well as to bring it more formally into your adaptive management systems when it's there in the indicator table. So ECCN added this to their work plan, and over the years, we've had an initiative to start to develop these indicators. It started within the support team and went through several rounds of review with specialists in conflict-sensitive education that we contacted to help give input into kind of finalizing a list. We definitely turned to the conflict-sensitive education pack, the INEE resources, as well as a previous USAID conflict sensitivity checklist that provided very helpful conceptual frameworks, categorization schemes for thinking about the kind of indicators we could develop. it was interesting to find that those tools, as useful and as sort of comprehensive as they are, had never taken the step of actually developing and proposing and drafting indicators that could be conceived as performance indicators on projects. To touch on, I think, a lot of the aspects of conflict sensitivity, I can highlight that as we were developing these indicators, there are different perspectives on what the real focus and prioritization should be. Some people took the perspective that these projects' main outcome of interest is increasing literacy, increasing quality of education, increasing access to education, and that conflict sensitivity should really think about primarily the do no harm approach. So that indicators should focus on just at the output level of showing due diligence around being conflict sensitive, therefore focusing on things like demonstrating that training was provided to all staff and to all relevant stakeholders. So we definitely do have indicators at that level. We do, along the lines of what Naomi was just discussing, encourage projects to think about training in terms of the actual learning content. So thinking about trying to measure that in terms of some sufficient demonstration of what has been learned and the skills around it on a post-test. Other people who were giving input to the review were more interested in aspects of institutionalization very much. And so we thought about ways to have indicators that borrow from a sort of organizational capacity assessment approach, using a lot of the content that was readily available within the INEE reflection tool and USAID conflict sensitivity checklist, to think about ways in which we could look at capacity aspects, not only within implementing partners, but within perhaps the ministry, within subcontractors and CSOs that partners work with. So touching on organizational capacity and the enabling environment of all those actors. Another category of indicator that other people were advocating for was very much around actual outcomes. And a third thing that Kelsey was highlighting was thinking through, what have the efforts to be conflict sensitive on projects actually brought about in terms of outcomes. So there was both an interest in thinking through perceptions of equity, inclusivity, fairness before and during and after a project, trying to monitor those among key stakeholders, including learners, parents, and teachers. Whether the project was doing anything to kind of move attitudes around whether people thought that the overall education situation is inclusive. And lastly, people thought about that some projects actually do have social cohesion and peace-building outcomes as part of their mandate, and thinking through that there could be indicators looking for, outcome indicators looking for progress in those areas. So we've developed a short list of these 14 indicators that you see on the screen. There's a longer list of over 40. These will be available, are immediately available on the ECCN website. We've also developed performance indicator reference sheets for the shorter list of 14, trying to give a lot of guidance and detail around the ways in which you could go about actually operationalizing indicators like this. We've included hyperlinks to the key tools that could help an implementing partner and a mission think through the key content of tools that you would use for these indicators. And we've provided other illustrative types of survey items that might also play a role in that. So we emphasize that we've developed all this as a resource. We think that some missions, some IPs might find indicators that they could readily use off the rack that would be very relevant to their projects, but we encourage practitioners to peruse them, be inspired by the kinds of ideas that they present for measuring and monitoring conflict sensitivity in a very formal and intentional way on your projects. We're also very interested in feedback. You can contact me directly, and we'll be trying to provide a mechanism for feedback and to continue to update this resource as experience with it comes in. So I'll be happy to answer any further questions about this initiative, and I'm going to turn it back over to USAID's Nina Weisenhorn, who's going to facilitate the question and answer period for the conclusion of this webcast.
Great, thanks so much, Daniel. And thanks to Emmeline, Kelsey, and Noemi for all those great insights. Now, for those who are still with us, if you scroll over your screen at the bottom center panel, you'll see a tab that's listed Q&A. We really want to collect your questions either directed at any of the individual speakers or across the speakers and make sure that we're responding to any questions that you have. So please go ahead and type in your questions and we'll make sure that we get those either addressed here today. And if we run out of time, we'll ensure that any questions that don't get answered are posted with answers on the INEE events website webpage for this webcast. But as we wait for some of your great questions to come in, I'd like to just ask each of the panelists to tell us a little bit more about the way forward. Maybe, Emmeline, we can start with you. What are some of the continued learning that INEE is taking on to better understand or build off of the research and findings from Kelsey? And then maybe we can send it over to Noemi to also talk about maybe what are your learning agenda questions at War Child. Over to you, Emily.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Nina. Well, INEE has different working groups and collaboratives that are still very interested in finding evidence and analyzing research that's being done on CSE. In 2021, INEE, as part of the DEFCO NRC consortium, will be launching some case studies on the current CSE trainings in DRC and Tanzania. So that's the latest update that I can give you from INEE's side. And if you have any, questions on upcoming events, you can contact us at INEE and we'll share the dates and try and put participants in contact with the organizations hosting the trainings.
Great. Thanks so much, Emmeline. And Noemi, how about you? What are you all seeing at War Child as the way forward for continued learning around conflict sensitivity in addition to the points that you raised?
Yeah, a lot of things. We also still have a lot of open questions, for sure. I mean, the first thing is we're very curious to see if this new way of building capacity is going to work and how it's going to work, if it's really going to equip education advisors better and in a more solid way than a one-off training might. But some of the other things that we've struggled with and we're looking to learn from others also is how to find allies across the organization to really embed conflict sensitivity across the organization. Because as Kelsey mentioned, we can't just think in our education bubble. We have to think about other people and other sectors as well. So how can we be working with our M&E team to make sure that we get some monitoring and accountability in? How can we work with, for example, our security advisors who are doing a lot of analysis on context to make sure that we have solid conflict analysis information that can feed into our programs, etc. Making sure that those linkages are there. And also another question that we have and we're hoping to learn is how can we work with partners outside our sector much more? As Kelsey said, it's so important to be looking at cross-sectionally or sectorally rather at conflict sensitivity. So how can we reach out to the right people in each context and make sure that we're collaborating and working together on conflict-sensitive education.
Great, thanks so much. That sounds like an exciting way forward and lots to learn. So we hope that as you learn, you'll share that back out with the community. We have a question here in the chat box from Andrea, and he has been one of our big champions through his participation in INEE working groups, attending the training of trainers. And he's sharing this great example about the fact that so often at trainings, we have young practitioners that may not even have a foundational understanding of the INEE minimum standards. And so this question's for you, Emmeline. We were wondering, have you experienced similar situations in the training activities you conducted, either in South Sudan, DRC, or Tanzania? And how do you address that, or what steps do you recommend that folks can take if they're planning to do a CSE training and want to make sure that foundational minimum standards knowledge is there before they get started?
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrea, for taking part in this webcast and for your question. It is a tricky one because this happens every time. With every single training that I've facilitated, I've been in that situation, and very often we send a questionnaire beforehand to participants, but sometimes a questionnaire on their knowledge of the INEE minimum standards. Very often the questionnaire doesn't reach the participants, so we don't have a chance to exchange with them prior to the training. A solution that I found, but it's obviously it requires more time, it's to offer half a day or a whole day on the INEE minimum standards, which is basically what I'm offering on Monday. So the training in Tanzania for the first time is going to be a 4-day training instead of a 2 or 3 day training as it was in South Sudan and DRC. We took into account the comments in the final evaluation, and we basically, so for Tanzania, we take them through a short introduction of what EIE actually is. Because often not only don't they know about INEE minimum standards, but they don't really understand the rationale for education in emergencies. They might not see themselves being in an emergency. So we start from scratch, and we guide them through the first step of learning about EIE, and then we move on to looking at the minimum standards. So I guess my answer is to build in more time to provide them with that knowledge. Another idea that we had for DRC was to convene like the freshmen of EIE or of INEE to come a day earlier to take part in a short training course on INEE minimum standards. So that's all I can suggest so far.
Great. I'm going to also take this opportunity, Emmeline, to build on that and do a little cross-promotion as well of the INEE Minimum Standards online course, I believe, is still active. Is that right? Yep, Emmeline's nodding. And ECCN also partnered with INEE to develop an online course for conflict-sensitive education. So if your organization may not have a trained trainer, or maybe there's not a trained trainer for facilitating a face-to-face, or maybe you don't have enough people to pull together, or finances to pull together a face-to-face training, both on INEE's website as well as internal to USAID's learning management system, USAID University, we are launching the conflict sensitive education online course. And those are also great tools that can be what we're using at USAID. We use that as a prerequisite for some of our other trainings, like the rapid education and risk analysis training, or our essentials in education in crisis and conflict training, where we want folks to come in with some foundational understanding on conflict-sensitive education, and we ask them to take that course, that online course, before attending a face-to-face training that uses that foundational knowledge in other ways. So I also encourage you, Andrea, or others who are looking for different multimodal ways of building the capacity of their staff, to also access those publicly available courses through the INEE website. And looks like we've got some other questions coming in. Let's see. So from mine, we'd like to share with you our pilot project that we recently did and a plan for the 2019-2020 school year and get advice, is with whom can they reach out to get advice or to share this experience? Maybe would Emmeline or Daniel, could each of you maybe talk through how INEE or ECCN can be a venue for that continued learning and sharing?
From INEE's side, the first person to contact, so it could be me, since you have the address today, but we would need to put your team in touch with the working group coordinator who's in charge of CSE, and then see what your project is about, and start a conversation. It's a little bit vague for me to reply with more details, but Maïn, please reach out to us, and we'll make sure that we help you with technical advice if this falls under the things that we can help you with.
From ECCN side, I would pretty much echo that, that you certainly can get in contact directly with me through the contact information that will be provided here, and I can get you in touch with our own conflict sensitivity experts and anyone that might be able to help you out and read details about your program. So thanks for asking.
We have a question here from Anna Wilson. And she would like to know from Kelsey, do you think there is a value in reframing conflict-sensitive education as an organizational change project or process, rather than an education technical process? Kelsey, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Anna. And I think that was the gist of a lot of what I was saying, actually, is a lot of these things are about organizational change as opposed to individual learning. A lot of the trainings that I witnessed, a lot of the educationalists are aware of how education can feed into conflict, especially if they're from those environments. What needs to be done is to have a mechanism to assess that on a regular basis. But the other thing, I think, while I've got the floor, just quickly, that I think I want to really emphasize is, I think some of the obstacles we'll face, and I don't think they shouldn't be faced, and we should be able to overcome them, but that some of the obstacles actually originate from the political economy of the aid industry itself. Quantitatively driven results, aversion to risk, short time frames, and an emphasis on technical rather than political and contextual sort of knowledge and skills. And they're all system-wide practices that can't easily be tackled through just education. So I think there are some opportunities here for the organizational change to be a cross-sectorial approach that might make it slightly easier for people to make changes.
Great, and I think I'm just going to go ahead and answer this last question from Zachariah, which is there a certified training on this? So yes, the conflict-sensitive education training, either delivered in person or online, does deliver a certificate at the end, which has that lovely INEE logo on it. So yes, you will get a certificate at the end, and the online course, to help ensure that you actually went through everything, has a number of end-of-module knowledge checks and quizzes to keep you engaged throughout the 90-minute modules. So thank you to everyone for joining. I will send a written response, Andrea, to your last question in the chat box. But please visit the ECCN website to see both the PowerPoint presentations from today, access the recording, as well as hyperlinks to many of the resources that we spoke about today. Please keep your eyes peeled for other events coming out this month. It's going to be very active in the webcasts for ECCN. Next week, we have the Perspectives on Humanitarian Development, Coherence, and Education. And then at the end of the month, on September 25th, please join us for the Perspectives on Education and Resilience. Thanks again, and have a great day.